Hey everyone, I'm Jay and I do stuff, and welcome back to another exciting episode of Jumping Thoughts. Some of Nintendo's iconic franchises have gotten their fair share of animated series. Mario, Zelda, and Pokemon to name a few. But I'm here to talk about Kirby's career in the animation scene. My own personal thoughts and ideas will come into play later. But for now, I'm gonna go over Kirby's history in animation. Quick disclaimer, I'm not counting animated commercials since they're really short and are mostly there to promote the games. Kirby's first appearance in animation actually starts with this educational video in Japan which tells stories while teaching kids how to read kanji. One story tells about Mario going up against Wario, but we're not here to talk about that. Instead, the second story on the other hand is about Kirby finding a lost puppy and helping it find its mother. This was made around the time Kirby's Adventure came out, so the characters are in their classic designs and they didn't have much to go off of. Not to toot my own horn or anything, but I actually redrew these story slides from scratch and remade that story on the video, which you can find on my channel. It wouldn't be until 2001 that we would get the first and only actual full Kirby show, Kirby Right Back At Ya, or as it's called in Japan, Hoshi no Kabi. Which really isn't all that creative of a name since the whole Kirby game series is called Hoshi no Kabi in Japan. I'm going to be referring to the English dub of this show since that's the version I grew up with. I know the dub has alterations and cut scenes opposed to the Japanese version, but personally I don't feel alcohol, guns, and religious burning rituals belong in the Kirby universe. Unlike some video game cartoon adaptations, this show is not canon to the games. This is a completely different universe than the one established in the games. The main plot of the show is that there's this war raging across the galaxy. The evil forces of Nightmare from Kirby's Adventure going up against the heroic Galaxy Soldier army made up of soldiers called Star Warriors. Most of the Star Warriors were wiped out by Nightmare's forces. Kirby is supposed to be like this savior talked about in Legends who's supposed to defeat Nightmare in the show, as opposed to the games where he's just some random kid who just happens to have some extraordinary powers. While flying around in his starship, Kirby detects some disturbance on nearby planet Popstar and crash lands. Despite the story being based on war and battle, the show itself is actually more laid back and comedic. Each episode consists of King Dedede coming up with some sort of wacky scheme which Kirby eventually foils, with an added Monster of the Week battle thrown in as well. On to the characters, starring with Kirby, he's actually a really basic character. He likes to eat and sleep, he's always there to save the day when there's danger. There really isn't much depth to Kirby's character other than that. Also, all Kirby can say in this show is... Masahiro Sakurai was part of the show's production, and with that he laid out some ground rules. One of them being that Kirby must not talk full sentences. I know Sakurai is our big daddy, but honestly I feel that this decision actually hurt the show more than it helped it. But I'll go over that later. Next is King Dedede. Unlike in most of the Kirby games, King Dedede is actually one of the primary antagonists of the show. He hates Kirby and wants to get rid of him. He does this by ordering monsters from this place called Nightmare Enterprises, which is basically Amazon.com for kaiju monsters. Nightmare Enterprises happens to be run by Nightmare, whom I've mentioned before, so they're pretty much in cahoots with each other. King Dedede also seems a lot more violent and rash in this show than in the games. Instead of, say, Bandana Waddle Dee, King Dedede is accompanied by the snail guy called Escargoon, who's basically like his assistant. Dedede has a tendency to absolutely abuse and wail on this guy a lot. He's pretty abusive to him. Mennonite is also here. He acts as a servant of King Dedede, but is secretly helping Kirby. They try to play this mysterious friend or foe thing with him at first, but later on it's pretty obvious he's a good guy. Instead of being the leader of the Mennonites, Mennonite is actually a Star Warrior from the Galaxy Soldier Army. He is accompanied by Sword Knight and Blade Knight. But if I'm being honest, compared to the games, this Mennonite is kinda lame. He doesn't use his cool tornado moves, and his cape doesn't even turn to wings. Nor can he use it to teleport. The most he can do is shoot out a sword beam from his sword, which Kirby can also do as well, so what's the point? He also knows quite a lot about Kirby and what he can do. I don't think this is ever really explained in the show. Maybe Mennonite just plays the games a lot? I don't know. Lastly, we have the show exclusive characters Tiff and Tuff. Tuff is the younger of the two siblings. He's a rascally little character. He tries to help Kirby sometimes, but more often than not, he usually kicks Kirby around like a soccer ball. He doesn't really have much depth or characterization as opposed to... Tiff, on the other hand, gets a lot more attention. She's the older of the two siblings and is very smart. She's usually found reading or out doing environmental nature stuff. However, being really smart, she can also be quite naggy towards more ignorant people. And she does this a lot.
Hey, you can't throw these things here!
Sure we can, it was empty!
Eco Tour Guide should be more aware of the environment. Hey, knock it off! What are you doing to that poor tree?
I'm just carving my initials in it.
How would you like some stranger to carve you? It's fine to admire the flowers, but not to pick them. Why not? We came here to study nature so we can learn to appreciate it and treat it with care. Let's leave the flowers for future visitors to enjoy. Okay.
We can't even pick fruit?
Not even if it drops off the tree. You either too.
Huh?
You have to watch where you're walking here, Mayor.
Dear, this is tricky.
This eco-tour hiking isn't any fun at all!
That isn't true. It's even more fun because it's educational. Hold on. Those birds should be in the forest, not on a grill.
These fallen leaves are so messy. I'll clean them up and take them away.
Don't do that. Those leaves provide lots of nutrients for the soil. Hey, let that fish go.
Be kind to wildlife, Chief Bucka.
Being like this when King Dedede is up to something I can get behind. But being this much of a know-it-all nag to everyone else, going about their everyday business, can get pretty grating. When you watch the Kirby show, you'll either like or hate this character. I for one am kind of in the middle. While I don't like Tiff acting like a bossy know-it-all, I get that that's kind of her shtick. Being a know-it-all is kind of her character, and for what she is, she does it pretty well, I guess. Aside from that, Tiff is also the main caretaker of Kirby. She is the keeper of the Warp Star. Unlike in the games where Warp Stars are a common find that fly you to a different location, in the show there's only one Warp Star, and it's treated as this sacred object that helps Kirby when he fights. Whenever Kirby's in trouble, Tiff calls out to summon the Warp Star to help Kirby. Now for one of my biggest complaints about the show. This show spends way too much time on Tiff and King Dedede than Kirby himself. Especially since he's the star of the show. King Dedede I can understand to an extent because he's one of the main characters slash villains, but Tiff never appeared in the Kirby game. Yet they practically make the show about her. As for Kirby himself, he doesn't nearly get as much screen time as I feel he should. I feel that this is likely because of Kirby's inability to speak. The writers probably didn't know how to write a character who can't speak, so they went to base the show mostly on the next main character. This is why I feel for a show about Kirby, that this would ultimately hurt the show more than it helped it. Sakurai might make great games, but I really don't understand his way of thinking sometimes. Some people probably wouldn't like it if Kirby were to speak full sentences, but as a huge Kirby fan myself, I really don't think it'd be that offensive. I'm not saying he would act like a wisecracking smartass like, say, Link or Sonic. Heck, even in that educational video I mentioned earlier had Kirby speaking full sentences.
泣かないで。僕がお母さんを探してあげるから。ここだな。でも、ちょっと怖いな。
So I don't see how having Kirby talk would have to be a bad thing. The most Kirby ever does in this show is fight the monster of the week. Everywhere else, he's just seen in the background doing whatever the other characters are doing. There's a couple of episodes that focus more around him, but for a show that's supposed to be about Kirby, this just isn't enough. All that in question is why I feel that Kirby is the weakest part of the show, and I feel sad admitting that. Next, I should probably talk about the animation style of the show. For the most part, the show is traditionally animated in 2D, however, there are some parts where some of the characters are CG. Now, I've heard from some places that this was done to make animation easier. Other places say they did just to be fancy with the current technology. This may have been somewhat revolutionary for anime at the time, but looking at it today, it just looks like outdated butt muffins. They tried to stylize it to fit in with the rest of the animation, but in the end, it just looks really obvious and out of place to me. The characters who seem to have the most CG are King Dedede, Escargoon, and especially Kirby. Very rarely do you see Kirby animated in 2D in this show, and while it is hard to screw up a character design like Kirby's, I honestly feel that he, as well as the other characters, look better in 2D. One thing I do like about the animation, however, is that for an anime, it doesn't really have that typical anime aesthetic. Instead, the show goes for a more cartoony look for the characters. If the character isn't a generic Cappy enemy, they're usually drawn with rounded eyes and have big bulging hands. I really like this art style, and I sometimes look to it for inspiration for my own art. At this point, I bet you think I've been pretty negative on this show. Then again, who isn't negative on the internet these days? But even with all its flaws, I still love this show. This is the very first thing Kirby I've ever been exposed to. Without it, I probably wouldn't be the Kirby fan I am today, so I can never bring myself to actually hate this show. I just don't think it's the best Kirby show. I love most of the characters and how they're expanded across the series. I also like how the show doesn't take itself too seriously. I mean, there are some moments that touch on characters who've been affected by the war against Nightmare, but most of the other episodes are more satirical parodies of certain pieces of fiction and pulp culture. Kinda like the Mario Super Show, except less blatant with its parodies. Some episodes even have cringy morals too, like don't litter, take care of the environment, they like to enforce this one a lot, brush your teeth, and alike. Ever since the show ended, countless media and even some of the games have had homages to the show. Even some of the characters kept their designs from the show, specifically King Dedede. It wouldn't be until around 2008 when the Kirby games started to regain their own identity, separate from the show, mostly with games like Smash Bros. Brawl and Kirby Superstar Ultra. But ever since, there hasn't been any other official form of animated Kirby media. With video game-based shows today, there's the Pokemon anime still going strong, despite a hilariously petty fan base, the new Mega Man cartoon that nobody watches, as well as the Netflix Castlevania series. I think it's safe to say that animated video game adaptations will still be a thing for years to come. I for one would love to see someone else take a crack at another Kirby cartoon. Especially now, since the world of the games are more fleshed out and there are more main characters to draw from. I sure would love to see another Kirby cartoon that's based on the games. Even if I'd have to make it myself.